Hello everyone, welcome to this discussion or conversation on neuroenergometry, more specifically DC potential. My name is Mikael Liimatainen. I'm working here in the Omega Wave headquarters in Finland, helping our clients here in Europe but also in China to use better our technology. And join me here. I'm by far no expert on neurobiology, so we are lucky to have Dr. Olga with us, explaining her vast knowledge to everybody out there watching this on what it is actually that we're measuring, where does it fall under the big umbrella of neuroenergometry. So welcome, Olga, and if you could please introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you, Mikael. And my name is Olga. I'm a neurobiologist, and I have expertise in psychophysiology and neurophysiology and EEG, brain mapping. So I'm in neuroscience for over than 25 years, I guess now. And neuroenergometry is something fascinating and very interesting, which can help you not just evaluate the state of the athletes, but it can be also useful addition for clinical setting. So today we are covering a little bit about what it means, neuroenergometry. Then we will discuss about DC potential. This is very interesting topic, and we have a lot of questions about what is it and where it originated and what it measures and so on. And then we also show a little bit how you can interpret the data, what you obtain from Omega Wave devices. And also, if you have time, maybe I can answer to some frequently asked questions.
All right, so let's move on, and if we still deal with the umbrella topic, so to speak, the neuroenergometry, before we go into the actual DC potential. So let's put some background into where does DC potential stand in the overall analysis of the brain. So how do we assess the brain's homeostatic balance in general?
Yeah, so to assess what is actually neuroenergometry, it has deal with many topics. It has something to do with brain energy metabolism. It's also assess brain activation state. It has, by neuroenergometry, you can measure also brain adaptability and brain performance capacity. So first, what means brain homeostasis, what we measure by neuroenergometry?
Yeah.
So this is the stable condition of the brain internal environment, like any other homeostasis. Yeah, it's some stable condition of the organ or stable condition of the organism. So in this case, we talk about brain homeostasis. So brain homeostasis can be altered by brain energy metabolism or brain activation level, and it's all maintained by brain adaptability or brain adaptation capacity. So how this all related? So first, brain energy metabolism is quite obvious. It's amount of nutrition what exists in the brain or it's coming to the brain. It's also depend on the good balance of the regulatory systems, which actually allows to the brain to have all this necessary nutritions and oxygen and glucose and so on. So when we talk about brain activation level and what it means and how it can affect the homeostasis, let's talk about functional brain state and also about internal and external factors which can change the functional brain state. I will still disclose a little bit all these topics later, but just to understand that besides level of nutrition or oxygen for the brain or some glucose or whatever, it's also very important other things like, for example, internal stress or some sickness is also can
pathologies.
Pathologics. Yeah. It can dramatically influence the homeostasis of the brain. When we talk about external factors, if a person happen to experience severe stress or something else, so this also will alter homeostasis of the brain. And when we talk about brain adaptability, like brain is in any complex system is constantly adapting to something what is changing internally or externally, and this means adaptability, how flexible the system of the brain, how quickly he can get the resources from the body to perform on the best level. So this is about adaptability. So now let's talk about functional state of the brain, what it is, and how it affects homeostasis and how it's related with energy and so on. So when we talk about this, we also talk about brain activation level or arousal. And in this case, it's the level of activation of the brain, which is different in different conditions. For example, and changing from lethargy to the activation. So we have
high concentration.
Yeah, or high concentration. Yeah. So we have a deep sleep, we have drowsiness, we have relaxation state or some activation state, and so on. So these all states, they can be measured from the brain, can be assessed from the brain, because they in each time the brain has different type of activities. And it's produced, for example, if you measure EEG, it's produced slower or more faster brain waves. We can also make a brain mappings, as you can see from the slide. And when we talk about, let's say, arousal level, it also deals with the balance of sympathetic and parasympathetic activity. And we know that, for example, when we are to perform, the brain should be on the particular activation state. So when we are in deep sleep, it's hard to perform something. But at the same time, for recovery, which is also very important, brain need to be in the relaxation state or in sleep state.
Interesting, yes.
So this is about like functional brain state, and that's how we acquire homeostasis. We have activity and we have relaxation. When it's in balance, we have
and when it's not, when there's tension, constant tension, then we know also something is not going well in the homeostatic
exactly. And
equilibrium
when
or balance of the brain.
The person can be in some state quite long, so it means already some pathological state.
Okay, excellent. So
besides
moving on with the functional state.
Besides that, we have like overall activation state, like relaxation or activation. We also have different systems in the brain, which is help us to actually process the information. So we have some information processing in our brain. We hear something or we see something, and then we process it and we make decision on it and so on. And we have particular systems in the brain which is actually taking care about each of these actions.
Functions.
Functions, each of these functions, right. So we have like sensory system, memory system, attention, executive system, motor system, affective system, whatever. And actually each of the system is very important in sport. And that's also good to know at which level each system in what particular time. And even in some sport, for example, maybe you need more for, let's say, sensory systems. And then we train the person to be more professional in processing the sensory stimulus. Or maybe we need the motor system, or maybe we need some attention system more. So this is also can be different.
Just to make it clear also for myself, is all of these are crucial elements that or crucial functions that the brain performs, and they are crucial for cognitive and physical performance. However, if I'm understood correctly, DC potential analysis goes into deciphering or analyzing part of it, but it's by no means the only thing, the only method that you can use to analyze these particular functions. So here we're just basically presenting overall how the brain functions, what are the different subsections, if you will, and DC potential goes into it, but it's not by any means the only thing
No.
a coach, a doctor, a sports scientist could deploy to analyze the brain even better, right? Just like with the heart, there's heart rate variability, there's all kinds of ways to analyze the cardiac muscle itself, right? So, did I understand it correctly like this? That
the DC potential, we are coming to DC potential soon, is just one method to evaluate brain activity.
Yeah.
So this is not, it doesn't go into the details of how our sensory system work or how our memory system. For this we use different type of...
but it's crucial for the viewers to understand that, you know, what are the different big functionalities of the brain that go into the functional state of the brain.
But it's also important to understand that, for example, if in the brain there is some problem with energy balance and with metabolism, any of this system can be affected.
Okay.
And in this case, you have no performance.
Yes, and that we can then detect with the...
Yeah, so it's not a direct measurements, but still it's kind of indirect measurements. And when performance is going down, maybe you can measure the DC and say, okay, something wrong. Maybe you don't need all this very expensive test and time-consuming test. So it's different, of course, different area and quite deep area and large area. We don't go there, just to understand
the big picture of the brain.
Yeah, it's not just drowsiness and attention state. It's also many other functions depend on the energy metabolism in the brain.
Got it. So looking into the brain energy metabolism then, what are we actually talking about? How is it related to what we are planning to discuss?
So, again, once more about brain energy metabolism. You know, even the brain is kind of small part of our body, but it uses about 20% of the overall energy. And the main source of energy for our brain is glucose. It's like up to 90% of actually energy source is glucose for the brain, but also the fatty acids and ketonic bodies and so on. But another important and very interesting thing in the brain that the neurons actually they are not able to feed themselves so well. Okay, they do can transport some glucose, but it's not direct connection to the capillaries or the blood system.
Vascular system. Yeah.
So for this they need additional cells. They named astrocytes, which process glucose for the neurons.
Yeah.
During this processing, we don't go to details so deeply at the moment, but important to understand that during this feeding process of neuron, the neuron and astrocytes produce lactic acid and carbonic acid. So they both increase acidosis in the fluid and also increase acidosis in the bloodstream. So as more neurons they are activated, as more astrocytes,
they need more activation, more food needed, more acidosis happens.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So the pH will change.
Yeah. Got it.
And this is very important for us. So we know that if the pH change, so the function of the neural tissue will change as well. So this is like a reaction is nothing stable in the brain, is always in some sort of balances, always try to keep some balance. But in some cases, for example, with excessive training or overload, the blood system and other system, they are not able to move this acidosis off from the brain tissue. So in this case, this can really increase and affect
the energy metabolism, the state of...
Yeah.
When you said overload, can that be both of physical nature, meaning training, running, lifting, and can it be also of cognitive or mental nature?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So it also can be anxiety state or it can be some traumatic experience or whatever.
Okay.
Some sort of
Perfect.
imbalance in psychological state again.
Okay. Good.
Psychological condition.
Oh, well, that's an interesting part. Definitely something that I also learned thanks to you.
So how usually we assess the metabolic dynamics in the brain? There exists positron emission tomography, which is measure utilization of glucose and oxygen in the brain. There is fMRI, which can show how the blood flow changes locally in the brain, and we use Neuroenergometry for this. Basically, we measure the changes of pH in the brain.
Via electrical signal analysis.
Yes.
Am I correct? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So within the neuroenergometry, within the kind of using electrophysiological feedback or information from the brain, if I'm correct, there are a lot of potentials. There are a lot of different, potentials, let's call them then, that we actually get from this type of methodology. Am I correct? Not just DC potential, but other.
Yeah, basically what I just talked, PET, fMRI, type of visualization, they use different methods to assess the brain functions. And neuroenergometry actually fall into the electrophysiological measurements. And when we talk about neurophysiological measurements and electrophysiological signals, if we talk about the brain, it is electroencephalography or EEG. It's event-related potentials. It's type of EEG which is recorded during the test and then mathematically processed to understand where is the what is the response of the brain to a particular signal. And then we also have infra-slow frequency potentials. And this type of potentials, they have a frequency band from 0 to 0.5 hertz. And they are measured also by electrophysiological settings from the brain, but they are actually dealing with energy metabolism. Then we have also electrocardiography. This is also electrophysiological measure, right? And also electrodermal activity. So quite often we have the question, is this infra-slow frequency potentials, they are actually related to electrocardiogram or this electrodermal activity? Actually, this is a different type of potentials, what we measure from there. It's a number of research which shows that it's not electrodermal activity.
Yeah, it's not related to that.
It's not
related. Not related to ECG.
Directly, at least.
Yeah.
And it's not an ECG.
Yeah, yeah.
Of course, it can be contaminated with one of these, but it's not exactly the same one.
But it's also different from standard EEG also.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, it's different in a way that usually in EEG, when we talk about EEG, we process the signal from 3 to 50 hertz. And this is something below 0.5 hertz. They are just slow processes in the brain.
Okay. So talking about then, let's go deeper into the infra-slow frequency potentials, because that's where we'll end up with talking about DC, right? DC.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So actually, DC is a part of the infra-slow frequency potentials. But now I will just very briefly try to describe what's the difference between them and what is it. So infra-slow frequency potentials have been divided to different type with different periods, like it can be from 2 to 11 seconds period and the amplitude of a few microvolts, or it can be period of minutes, and they are usually a little bit bigger in amplitude in microvolts also. And when we talk about DC potential, this is not a wave, it is shift. It is something which goes smoothly or sometimes quite dramatically up or down. So this is not a periodic wave. This is some process which is quite constant in the brain, has some constant level, and this constant level can continue from minutes to hours.
Is this, when we talk about shift, now it makes me think about also shift in body position, shift in wakefulness level. Does that actually have any relationship to the shift in DC potential if I go from vertical to horizontal? Is that relevant for the measurement? The body position different level of wakefulness? Or could I measure this shift also in standing in vertical position?
If you change the position, it's going to be an artifact of movement.
During the measurement, you mean?
Yeah. But of course, if, for example, you were standing and then you change your position and you measure it again, we could expect that it can change.
Okay.
But how dramatically is different stories, again, about adaptability of the system. But usually any EEG signal measurements, they done in the normal state when the person is relaxed, or sitting or lying down, so it's not moving so much.
Right. So relaxed, but you could be sitting, you could be lying
you can
down.
do something.
It's not critical to be. You absolutely have to be lying down to get the signal correctly. Okay.
Of course.
All right. Good.
There is certain methodological recommendations and requirements to measure it correctly, but just to understand that the main point here, because people constantly asking what is DC, and I see a mess in the literature, because some people say that DC is everything what we measure from the brain, and other say that DC potential coming from event-related potentials. Actually, there are some slow potentials as well, and they call it C and V, for example. It's slow potential, but it doesn't mean that it's DC, which is measure exactly the energy metabolism, and at least in the way what we are discussing now.
So that's the take-home message really is DC is measuring the energy metabolism state of the brain.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be confused with other things we can measure from the brain that explain other phenomena.
Exactly. But here even more, actually DC potential is universal for all body. It doesn't mean that you only can measure acidic base homeostasis in the brain. It can be in any other tissue. And so this is not specific to the brain, the DC potential. For example, when we talk about infraslow frequency potential, they are specific to the brain, more or less. But DC,
but understanding that metabolism state from the brain is important, because brain is the most important organism of the human body, right?
At least now we talk about the brain, so now we talk about DC potential in the brain.
Yes, good.
And from the slide you can see that, for example, if we do some stimulation, all spontaneous infraslow frequency potential will change, but also DC potential has shift. And we can measure this shift and we can evaluate it.
And stimulation here could be everything from holding your breath to doing push-ups.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So how do we actually then measure the DC potential? Because everybody, I mean, those who are listening to this, viewing this, and are familiar with omega wave, they know that we measure from the forehead, and then from the hand, from the base of the thumb. And sometimes I do get questions, well, what's the purpose of are you measuring something from the brain, but then you have an electrode here? So then we say, well, it's what Ilyushina discovered. So could you explain a bit why are we doing? Was it really Ilyushina who detected that this method works? Yeah,
Bechtereva and Ilyushina, they was at the beginning of the studies, and they did a lot of research. They measured all this infra-slow frequency potential from the brain, from the deep, from the electrode inserted deep into the brain,
yeah.
and also from the scalp. And it was just found that DC potential can be recorded with best amplitude in this type of setting from the frontal lobe or vertex and with reference placed on the tenor. But also people place the referent electrode to other areas. And for example, quite many research done about the distribution of DC potential. So in this case, we apply many electrodes like FZ, CZ, PZ, OZ, and temporal areas. And again, it can be measured in reference to the tenor, or we can place the electrode on the earlobe, and it's also possible. But in this case, the signal will have a little bit different features, like amplitude is not going to be exactly the same like what we measure in the first setting. So now when we go to the DC potential more deeply, and as I told already, so this is not a fluctuation, it's some stable potential which is shift smoothly or quite abruptly, and which is registered in the range from the 0 to 0.5 Hertz. So as I also mentioned, the DC potential can be measured from inside the brain, outside of the brain. It can be measured on other tissues, visceral organs, so from muscles.
But some of those, as we can hear, they are not very practical, at least for sports. So,
yeah,
so
true. So depending on the site where we registered this DC potential, of course it's going to represent the local metabolism in this area. For example, if we measure it from the muscle, so we measure it, the pH from the muscle. We don't measure it from somewhere else. And if we measure from the brain, so it's from the brain.
Can we only say, based on analyzing the state, an energetic state of the brain via the DC potential analysis, can we only say from a sport performance point of view that independent of which bad side we're on, low or high, it will have an impact on performance, but we can't actually in a detailed fashion predict how these two conditions might differ from a performance point of view?
Okay, actually there are this kind of research.
Okay.
They are exist. And we are going to prepare a review publication about this.
Interesting.
Hopefully.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, of course, like as we discussed before, it's all about homeostasis. When the person in the particular activation state, he can perform on the best level. If something is going down from any side, so it's going to affect everything. So the DC potential just reflect the level of activation and the capacity and the possibility of the brain to still perform, to still do something. And the different part of DC potential, the form of DC potential, the amplitude of this shift, and how quickly a person can adapt to the, let's say, some training load. It all has particular effect in the sport.
Yeah.
And we can predict the outcome.
We can better understand the athlete's ability to adapt favorably to any load, external. Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
I will try to show some things still a little bit later, maybe.
Yeah.
So now we talk a little bit about the origin of DC potential. I already mentioned that basically we measure pH, the acidic level, acidity in the brain. So if you can see from the slides, the scientist tried to measure the DC from inside the brain, from the cortical surface, from scalp, under the skin and then from the skin. And what they found that actually when we go from the cortical surface to the skull, the polarity of the signal change. So in this case, scientist has been wondering that probably is the DC potential what we measure directly from the skin, maybe also measure the potentials from the blood vessels. So basically it's measuring not exactly the electrical neuronal activity, but it measures something else.
And is that a problem from an data interpretation point of view?
No, just again to understand that first of all it has clear, we clearly can measure this potential even without skin. So this is not electrodermal activity, once more. And the second, this potential measuring the blood acidic level. And as you can see also from the slide, they have been measuring pH on the surface of the brain and in the blood vessel. And the graphs, they are completely same, totally similar.
So am I understanding it correctly then that, you know, the point of this is, even though we're measuring from the surface of the skin, not underneath it, not underneath the cranium either, but we're still measuring information from the brain. It's not a potential or information that solely is generated by the skin and the vessels on the surface of the...
Yeah, of course, sure. Because if when some part of the brain is activated, so it's blood flow is activated in this area. Utilization of glucose and oxygen increase in this area.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
no, I just wanted to...
it's increased acidosis, and this goes to the blood flow and then changes the potential of the blood vessel, and we can measure it.
Okay, excellent, good. So
now if we talk a little bit about what we can get from DC potential features. So DC potential, here on this slide we have different graphs with DC potential forms. This was identified by Ilyukhina and colleagues. And sure, when we measure it from the omega wave device, it's not exactly looks the same. But in the DC potential, we look the trend. We don't exactly expect that we have so straight lines from the...
You mean the shape of the curve in one measurement, or trend? Do you mean trend as in multiple measurements over time, or do you mean the
I mean
the
just
shape of the curve in one measurement?
Yes,
okay.
Yes. So of course they don't look so nicely. Not exactly. And you can see, like, depending on what type of shape we have, we can already say maybe this person has low arousal or high arousal, or it has instability of some kind. So the shape tell us quite a lot about the
So not just the stabilization value, but also the shape tells us information.
Yes.
Good.
So then also when we talk about the, for example, scalp distribution, I mentioned that it's possible to measure these DC potentials from different parts of the scalp. So in this case, the distribution of the signal also is going to tell us quite a lot about what's going on. Like, for example, if the frontal lobe doesn't get enough oxygen, or is not enough supplemented with glucose, so we are going to see decrease of the potential or some changes in the potential in the frontal lobe or other parts.
So at least in theory, it could be interesting to measure athlete from different parts at times, but in practical way, it's a challenge because you'd have to shave your head, right, to get the data from different parts. No,
it's normal standard EEG.
Okay. If you had that,
setting.
okay. If you had that kind of what
If
you
you
had,
have the cap and or
But
just
if you used
single.
our type of electrode that stick to the skin, then that's a different
Okay,
story.
but you don't need it. So
Okay,
you can
yeah.
use normal
Normally.
argentum chloride electrodes
Okay, yeah.
with electropass.
Yeah.
So
And then you can,
this
yeah.
possible, yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
good.
there exist a specific electrodes which was designed by Ilyuhina and colleagues in St. Petersburg, and they have patented it, but it's something very special, and it's not
Okay.
something what you can buy from
Yeah.
the market at the moment, at least.
Okay.
Yeah, but anyway, on the lower level of this slide, I just show you the real potential from the client, some clinical cases, and you can see that they have different amplitude and different
Directions
forms
even, yeah.
and directions, yes. And actually all of these people, they have abnormal level and shape of the DC potential, and also all these people, they have some clinical disorder, and they suffer from anxiety and or chronic fatigue. So
Okay. Interesting.
that's how we actually that's for we use DC potential in clinical practice.
Right. Okay. And if I have a person, let's say I have a person with high level of chronic stress, anxiety, whatever you want to call it, is the way to really see that there is something going on, something fishy going on, so to speak, that I have to see these kind of patterns, similar patterns on successive measurements. It can't be just one time acute data. I have to see it chronically to really diagnose that, hey, there's something that might be mental. Let's say if we talk about athletes, right? Obviously we always, first thing obviously for a trainer is, well, maybe it's too much physical training. But if I then do an intervention, I reduce volume or I reduce intensity of the training or both, and I still don't get the optimal shift, I still get some of those not so good looking shapes, would I then need to see kind of over time similar shape of curve to pinpoint my analysis or my conclusion that, hey, this has nothing to do with physical activity levels, but it's something that is more of mental nature, and other interventions then are needed for the athlete to, let's say, come back to.
Exactly. So you can use, and it's so easy to measure this DC potential, so you can use this information to monitor your athletes, how well they manage in the everyday practice. You can measure even every day, like what we're doing with Omega Wave, right? So, and then you can see what's changed. And then other specialists, like sports psychologists, maybe discuss with the person, depending on what exactly needed for him.
Perfect.
But if suddenly you can see in your athlete, which is before was quite normal, that his DC potential changes, you have to think what's going on. Is it related to the training? Is it related to some stress outside of the sport?
Life factors.
Whatever, or maybe it's something to do with the fail on the last Olympic Games or whatever.
Yeah.
So
mental anxiety.
anything can affect.
Good. So what we are then looking at specifically from the DC potential curve, three things, right? And can you go a little bit more detail into the three factors that you can use to analyze this information if you're a trainer?
So we usually look initial level of the DC potential. Then during the recording, and of course it's recommended that we have at least 5 minutes recording, maybe more if it's possible. Not always possible in sport setting, but still. So we can assess the stabilization time, because from the initial point, there's usually some time until it's stabilized and coming to the so-called plateau. Then we measure the level of the DC potential
At the plateau.
At the plateau, and we know also stabilization time. Actually, the time what is needed for stabilization has quite a lot information per se. For example, if someone stabilizes too long, over than let's say 7 minutes, it can be related with anxiety state. So the person simply can be on the relaxation state, can become like calm or whatever. So his brain is not able to adjust his metabolism fast enough.
Okay.
And of course...
so what would be, for a high-level athlete, what would be the recommended stabilization time, more or less?
Something around 3 minutes.
Okay,
It's
3 or less.
fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and also we had some question, but what we can find if we will measure DC potential before intervention or training, and then after. Intervention.
What is the
Yes.
information we can get from the, especially from the post?
And what we can measure actually. So basically same. So we measure initial point. We measure the time needed to come to the plateau and the level at there. Then we have certain intervention, and then we measure time needed to recovery. And also level how far it goes.
Sorry,
after the
when you said
intervention.
time needed for recovery of what? Recovery of the
Curve, yeah.
So it had
when it's come back to the
stabilization point,
yes.
then that means
Yeah.
recover. Okay.
Yes, it's also we talk in this case about how quickly the system adapt
Right.
to any kind of treat. This
Right.
can be psychological treat or physiological treat or whatever.
Yeah.
So and each of these parameter has certain information.
You mean the time interval, like
Time
the first
interval,
one to
amplitudes.
Yeah.
And the reactivity of the system, like for example, after you finish some exercise of brief holding test or whatever, so you can see which level this particular person reach.
So what would be for the practitioner, what would be your recommendation or your analysis of the requirement of why would I do the post test? Is it enough in most cases just to do the pre-test, or when would it be particularly useful to also apply the post-training, post-intervention test as well?
I would think that especially, maybe in everyday routine, you can just measure, and when you need an information, what type of training can be recommended for this particular athlete today. Maybe you don't need to do an intervention.
You just do the pre-test.
Yes, but when you need some sort of assessment of what this athlete can do and what is the state of his regulatory systems, maybe you can do then some intervention.
So,
like, in sport we're doing many things.
So are you saying that with the post test I can better, in a more precise way, see how a certain intervention actually stressed or affected the human being, the athlete, and by looking at the recovery speed and the shape of the post test, I have better idea of how well he recovers, how effectively he recovers from this type of stimulus.
Yeah.
The pre-test tells us, is he ready to train at certain intensity level, for example, in general, but then I apply training X, training Y, and I can, with the post-test, understand, with training X, seems like he really needs, it's not so good, the recovery, adaptability, but to training Y, there's better adaptability. Am I interpreting your message right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Because maybe in the morning, the person measures himself and it's fine, but his system is overreactive, or there is something else
that we can't measure
we
we
can measure just right now. But maybe this particular training load was too much for him.
Yeah, something new completely to the organism. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
It's any kind of test.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
can just
Interesting.
speculate now about this.
Interesting. Yeah,
But
sure.
still, it's just something pre-test, test, and post-test.
Yeah.
It's quite normal.
No, it's good. It's good because
measurements.
the post test is something I think a lot of our viewers haven't done regularly. So understanding why and how you could use it in sports setting, in performance setting, I think it's important to know. So people who are interested, they can add that to their measurement arsenal.
Yeah, exactly.
Good.
You talk about how the activation related to performance and what is to do, let's say, with frontal lobe. Basically, with training and performance, our frontal lobe is actually consuming the most of the energy. It's controlling almost everything what we are doing, and also motor activity together with premotor cortex. So of course, if the oxygenation and utilization of glucose or nutritions increase or decrease in the frontal lobe, it will affect DC potential.
What about, because you mentioned the word trauma, to all of our athletes who are in the combat sport business, especially those combat sports where you can hit and kick somebody in the head, are there studies, are there conclusive studies done in Russia where they've analyzed that sport-related trauma in a boxing match, in an MMA fight, whatever, that we can actually pick up the trauma caused to the brain via a certain level of DC potential. That with athletes who suffer trauma, they're always in a very low DC potential level or at a very high DC potential level until the trauma goes away.
Okay. Unfortunately, I don't know this
Okay.
type of research.
Okay.
Probably they done, but not everything you can access.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, just that.
So this is something what we can try to find out.
Okay. Great. All right. I think that was the end of it. Then there were a few interesting questions coming from. So if we take some of those, let's not dwell into all of them, because graciously Olga wrote answers to most of them. But a few things I'd like to highlight here. So one of the things is HRV. Now HRV, heart rate variability, measured from electrocardiograph, is obviously very used and kind of popular in the West, in sports and also in medical science. Why would you need, or what added value would you get if you are a strength and conditioning coach in sports related, in sports? What additional value would you get from DC recording if you're already doing HRV? Okay,
but as I mentioned previously, not just physiological condition of the body, like for example, which is represented by heart rate variability, affect homeostasis, but also, let's say, psychological state or poor sleep or something else can affect performance. And for this we can use DC potential.
So basically we're just adding another layer of information to understand better the athlete's adaptability. So it's not, they're complementary. They're not substitutes, they're complementary information, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Like, and because we can access to the information about functional brain state, in which state this person.
And HRV won't tell me anything about that. Good. No. Okay. Well, this is what you already actually explained. But let's recap. So, what's the role of having an unstable potential, or sudden peaks, or regular oscillation, regular undulation? What does that tell us?
Okay, first, like I mentioned already, you can't expect that normal potential is going to be so flat and nice looking like on the graph. But still, of course, on the top of the DC potential, we can measure other infraslow frequency potentials. And depending what type of potentials we have there, how many of them, and period of them, and so on, we can also have, it also has some diagnostic values.
Okay. So what's the relevance of DC potential for cognition, cognitive ability?
Okay, we also discussed about this briefly at the beginning, and again, if some part of the brain doesn't get enough resources or doesn't have enough energy to produce particular actions, so then of course the cognition is not going to be on the best level.
Right.
Like when we talk about frontal lobe deficiency, the person can't concentrate, and also could have some problem with working memories, and there can be other problem as well.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Well, I think this one wraps up the first session, hopefully of many that we will have with Olga. Last but not least, if anybody is interested beyond what Omega Wave does in learning about the brain, DC potential, or other aspects of the brain, how can they get in contact with you?
I think we can. I can give all information at the end of this video.
Okay, so we can add a extra slide there with your email and where they can locate you.
And welcome, if you have any questions, please.
Don't hesitate. Yes.
Yes, don't hesitate.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much.